Hey guys, tonight we begin with the sound of a door you are absolutely not supposed to open. That slow, squeaky groan of hinges that tells you someone is either about to discover the best gossip of the century, or lose their head by breakfast. And judging by the way your heart is thumping right now, you're hoping for the first option, but mentally preparing for the second. Because here you are, standing barefoot on the cold rush-covered floor of Hampton Court Palace sometime in the early 1500s. Clutching a candle whose flame is bending and shivering like it knows secrets are about to spill. And all around you the air smells faintly of beeswax, damp stone, and something much more curious, the faintest trace of rosewater perfume and roasted venison. Drifting from a door up ahead, the one with the carved Tudor roses on it, the one they told you never to go near unless you were summoned. Because this, dear friend, is the threshold to the royal bedchamber. And in Tudor England, that wasn't just a place where kings and queens slept. It was a political nerve center, a gossip factory, and in ways you are about to find out, a very selective membership club where access could change your entire fortune overnight. Sometimes literally overnight, if you catch my drift. And as you take a cautious step closer, you're probably picturing silken sheets, candlelight, maybe a crown tossed casually on a pillow. But the truth is that what lay beyond those doors wasn't always about romance, or even scandal in the way the court poets liked to write about it. No, it was about control. About who got to see the king's nightshirt hanging on a peg, or watch the queen's hair being braided for bed. And yes, that sounds absurd, until you realize that these bedroom privileges weren't just invitations to peek at someone's pajamas. They were golden tickets to proximity, to influence, to being the one who could whisper something into royal ears, while everyone else was stuck freezing in the drafty great hall. So as you reach the doorway, you remember the whispers you overheard in the kitchens, that last winter. One minor gentleman with nothing but a borrowed doublet managed to become a close favorite of the king, simply by being chosen to hold the royal basin, while His Majesty washed his hands before bed. And by spring, that same man had a manor, a title, and enemies he didn't even know the names of, because in Tudor courts, the bedchamber was as much a battlefield as any field of war. Except here, the weapons were favors, secrets, and the ability to keep a straight face when you saw the king without his wig. And already your mind is running wild with possibilities. Because if you could just get inside, you might see the truth for yourself. The subtle nods between the chamberlain and the royal physician. The coded phrases slipped into casual conversation. The way a single raised eyebrow from the groom of the stool could mean the difference between being invited to the next hunt or being sent home in disgrace. And, yes, in case you're wondering, groom of the stool was a real job title. And yes, it meant exactly what you think. And no, it wasn't considered shameful. In fact, it was one of the most trusted positions in the entire court. Because if you were literally the person who helped the king in his most private moments, you became a vault of information, and information in Tudor England was worth more than gold. Worth more than land, worth sometimes even more than loyalty. So as you lift your candle higher, trying to make out shapes beyond the partly open door, you hear voices, low and urgent, the rustle of silk, the clink of something metallic. And suddenly it's obvious. Whatever is happening in there tonight is not just another bedtime routine. This is a gathering, and not the kind that will be recorded in the official chronicles. Oh, no. This is the kind of gathering that will only exist in whispers. A meeting of the chosen few who have been allowed into the most intimate royal space to plot, scheme, or settle matters that can't be discussed in council chambers. And maybe it's just the candlelight playing tricks, but you could swear you see a shadow on the wall, moving with a deliberate slowness, like someone holding up a piece of parchment for another to read. And for a moment you wonder, is that a treaty, a love letter, a list of names? Whatever it is, it's enough to make your pulse quicken. Because you're starting to realize that in this world, the bedchamber isn't just a room. It's the innermost circle of power, a place where the public mask comes off, where royal authority is stripped down to its most vulnerable, and the people allowed in, the so-called gentlemen of the bedchamber, or ladies of the privy chamber. They are not just servants, they are gatekeepers, kingmakers, sometimes executioners, in silk. And you, well, you're still in the doorway, wondering whether to push the door further or retreat before someone spots you. Because, as intoxicating as it is to imagine stepping into that warmth and candlelight, you also know that those privileges came at a price, and that price could be your silence, your allegiance, maybe even your life. But just as you start to lean forward, your toes curling on the cold floor, you hear something that freezes you in place. A name. Your name. Spoken softly, but with the kind of authority that makes you certain whoever said it knew exactly you were there. And as the shadows shift, and the candle in your hand flickers dangerously low, you realize that perhaps you weren't just wandering by after all. Perhaps you've been summoned without knowing it. Perhaps your invitation to the most dangerous room in the palace has just arrived. And if you step through that door now, you'll find out why. But of course, if you think the mystery ends here, oh no, we've only just cracked it open. And what happens once you cross that threshold will make you wish you'd never left the safety of the kitchens. Or make you very glad you did. Because what's waiting inside isn't just royal bedding. It's the very heart of the Tudor game. And you're about to play it. You don't remember deciding to move. But somehow your foot has already crossed the threshold. The candlelight pooling ahead of you in little trembling puddles on the polished wood. And the air here is warmer, thick with the layered scents of cinnamon, musk, and the faint, almost medicinal tang of some herbal infusion brewing nearby. A detail you clock immediately, because in Tudor courts, nothing was ever accidental. Not even the smell of the room, and every scent, every object. Every person here had a purpose, a position, a silent message, and the one you've just walked into is telling you that you are now inside the most controlled and dangerous chamber in England, where power is not shouted across a council table, but whispered between two people standing close enough for their breath to fog the same glass. And the first thing you notice is that everyone here is pretending not to notice you, which of course means they have noticed you entirely. And as you glance around, you realize the so-called bedroom looks less like a private retreat and more like a theater set for the most exclusive performance in the kingdom. The grand canopy bed is pushed slightly back, almost an afterthought, while in the foreground, there's a table laid with letters, sealed in red wax, a silver bowl half full of what looks like sugared almonds, and a chessboard with the game already mid-match. Black Queen threatening a white rook, which you suspect is not just a game, but a hint about something much larger. And before you can linger on that, a man in rich but understated velvet steps forward, the deep plum of his doublet making him seem like a shadow that somehow has weight, and he says your name again, softly, as though it's a test. Watching the way you react, the way your eyes flicker, because here, reactions are currency, and anyone allowed in this space is being evaluated constantly. Not for their charm at dinner, or their performance at the joust, but for their ability to survive this silent game of proximity, where knowing too much and showing it is just as deadly as knowing nothing at all. And you realize, with a jolt, that this is the groom of the stool himself. The man whose role in the king's daily life is so intimate and trusted that his word can open or close the gates to fortune. And it dawns on you that this summons may not be random, that perhaps you've been chosen for a test or a task. Something that will bind you to the heart of this court in ways you can't yet see. And even as he gestures you forward, past the perfumed women in their pearl-threaded hoods, and the lean young men leaning on chairs, as if they've been here their entire lives, you feel the weight of every pair of eyes measuring you, assessing what kind of piece you'll be on their chessboard. Because, make no mistake, in the Tudor bedchamber, you are either a player or you are a pawn. And pawns do not last long then, as you step closer to the bed itself. You see the curtains shift, and they're half reclined against pillows. The king himself is not wearing the heavy robes and jeweled chain you've seen in the great hall, but a loose nightshirt of fine linen, his hair slightly mussed, his feet bare. And it's like seeing a lion without its mane, still dangerous, but startlingly human. And in that moment, you understand the real privilege of the bedchamber, not the silks, not the nearness, but the access to the monarch without the armor of ceremony. The chance to influence him when he is most himself, and if you think that means you can just walk up and start making requests, think again, because this privilege is a trap as much as a gift, and one wrong move, one misplaced comment, could mean your banishment before sunrise. But before you can dwell on that, the king beckons you closer, his eyes sharp despite the softness of the setting, and you realize he's holding a folded piece of parchment. its wax seal already broken, and as he hands it to you, you can feel the heat of the room tighten. The low murmur of conversation falling silent, as everyone waits to see what happens next. You open it, half expecting a love poem, half expecting an execution order, and instead find a list of names. Some you recognize, some you don't, each one with a small mark beside it, either a dot, a cross, or a crown. You look up at the king, unsure, and he smiles faintly. The kind of smile that says, you've just been invited into something much larger than yourself. But also that refusing is not an option. And as you stand there, parchment trembling slightly in your hands, you realize you may have just been drawn into the deepest secret of the Tudor bedchamber, that what happens here decides not only who shares the royal table, but who keeps their head, their land, their life, and you're in it now, whether you like it or not. What the marks mean, you'll find out soon enough. If you survive the night, the parchment feels heavier than it should, as if each name and each little symbol beside it carries the weight of an entire life, and in this room, it does. You lower your eyes to study the list again, partly to avoid the direct gaze of the king, partly to buy yourself a few seconds of thought. Because here in the Tudor bedchamber, hesitation can be fatal, but so can speaking too quickly. The candlelight wavers over the ink, turning the dots into little shimmering coins, the crosses into tiny daggers, the crowns into something both tempting and terrifying, and your mind scrambles to decode them. A dot could mean safe, a cross could mean condemned, and a crown, well, a crown could mean favored, or it could mean next in line for trouble. Because in this court, favor is just the front porch of disaster. You glance up and notice that the groom of the stool hasn't moved from his place, his eyes fixed not on the king, but on you. As if the real test is not in holding the list, but in what your face betrays as you read it. The king shifts in his pillows, a small movement, but enough to send ripples through the chamber. A lady at the far side adjusts her posture. A young courtier suddenly becomes very interested in the sugared almonds. Another man leans in to whisper to someone behind. His hand, you feel the walls themselves pressing in, heavy with tapestries and secrets. This is not just a bedroom, this is a vault. Every breath here is recorded, every glance stored away for later use, because the privy chamber is a place where history is made before it ever leaves ink on parchment, and where those not meant to survive it are quietly erased before anyone outside knows their names. You're about to ask the king what the marks mean when you catch a flicker of movement in your peripheral vision. One of the ladies of the privy chamber, her hood shadowing her face, is watching you intently. It's not the casual curiosity of someone noticing a newcomer. It's the sharp, weighing stare of someone trying to read what you already know, or suspect. Her hands are folded neatly, but her thumb is tapping against her ring in a rhythm so deliberate, it almost feels like code. You realize, with a slight jolt, that in this room, messages are sent in the way a fan is held. In the order, wine is poured, in a pause between words. The bedchamber is a language you don't speak yet, and the problem with not speaking, the language is that you can't tell if you've just agreed to your own ruin. The king clears his throat, and everyone freezes, even the almond-chewing courtier. You'll take this list, he says quietly, and you'll remember it. The way he says it, not asking if you can remember it, but stating it as if it's already decided, makes your pulse jump. You glance down again, fixing the names in your mind, but before you can speak, the parchment is plucked from your hands by the groom of the stool, who folds it in a way that makes it disappear into his sleeve. You'll need to be discreet, the king adds, his eyes narrowing with something that could be amusement, could be warning, could be both. Then, without any formal dismissal, the room exhales. The tension eases, but only a fraction. Conversation resumes quiet and careful, like a river still flowing beneath thin ice. You're left standing, unsure whether to bow, retreat, or pretend you belong here. A figure sidles up beside you, a man younger than you expected, with a fox-like face and the faintest trace of wine on his breath. First time in the lion's den, he murmurs without looking at you. Here's some advice. Never assume you've been given the whole truth, and never ever let them see you keep a secret they don't already know about. His words are light, almost playful, but there's a blade under them. Before you can ask who they are, The fox-faced man is gone, sliding through the crowd like smoke. You glance back toward the bed, but the curtains have been drawn part way. And the king is speaking to a different knot of courtiers now, his face in profile, unreadable. Somewhere in the room, a laugh rings out, too loud for comfort, too quick to be genuine. The lady with the tapping thumb is gone, and that's when you realize something else. You didn't just receive a summons tonight. You were being placed into a role, into a game already in progress. You don't know yet if you're meant to be a messenger, a spy, or a scapegoat, but you do know one thing. Whoever marked those names did it for a reason. And if you don't learn what those marks mean before someone else decides for you, you'll be the one with a cross next to your name. And in this court, a cross isn't for blessings. It's for endings. Of course, the problem is, the only way to find out the meaning is to step deeper into the bedchamber's web, and once you're in, there's no way out that doesn't cost you something. The question is, what will it cost you first? The air in the bedchamber has that strange density now. Not the kind that comes from heat or candle smoke, but the kind that tells you something is happening just out of sight, just out of earshot, and that if you're clever enough, you might catch a fragment of it. You stay still, letting your eyes wander lazily, as though you're just admiring the gilded bedposts and embroidered cushions. But in truth, you're mapping the room. Every player has shifted since the king drew the curtains, halfway, creating pockets of movement that pull attention away from the real center of the action. At the far end of the chamber, near the window where the winter night presses black and cold against the glass, two figures are half hidden in the heavy shadow of the bed canopy. You can't see their faces, but you can see the angle of their shoulders close, conspiratorial, and the faint glimmer of metal at one figure's waist. Perhaps a dagger hilt. Perhaps something less obvious, but equally sharp. A servant carrying a silver ewer passes between you and them, and in that moment you catch it, a single word, or perhaps a name, barely above a whisper: Norfolk. Your mind leaps to the Duke, one of the most dangerous men in England, his loyalty to the crown always tangled up with his own ambitions. You've heard enough gossip in the kitchens to know that Norfolk's name is a lit fuse, and that in this court, whoever speaks it either plans to light it, or is about to be burned by it. You make a slow, casual move toward the sugar almonds, not because you want them, but because from there, you'll have a cleaner angle on the shadowed conversation. But before you've taken 2 steps, the lady with the tapping thumb reappears, blocking your path with a smile that is all teeth. You should eat, she says lightly, as if this is a dinner party, and not a gathering of people who could ruin you with a sentence. You look pale. You open your mouth to reply, but she leans in just enough for you to feel the brush of her breath against your ear. Whatever you think you heard just now, she murmurs, you didn't. Then, without waiting for an answer, she glides away, her skirt swishing like a curtain drawn over a stage. Your pulse kicks up, but you force yourself to stand still, one hand resting lightly on the almond dish, as though nothing in the world could be more interesting than sugared nuts. This, you realize, is another rule of the bedchamber. If someone warns you to forget something, it's because that something matters far more than you can yet guess, which means you need to remember it perfectly. A movement from the canopy draws your eye again, but this time it's not the 2 shadowed figures, it's the groom of the stool himself, emerging from behind the bed curtains, adjusting his sleeve as though he's just hidden something inside it. He catches your gaze and holds it for a moment, long enough to make it feel deliberate, before moving toward the king. You don't hear their words, but you see the king's face change. The faint tightening around his mouth, the small sharp nod, and then, as if on cue, the chamberlain calls for the musicians in the next room to play. A signal that whatever business was being conducted here is over for now, or at least pushed behind another layer of ceremony. But as the lute music drifts in, you notice something odd. One by one, a select few courtiers begin to leave, slipping through a narrow side door behind the bed. They don't look at each other, they don't speak, they just vanish into the dark, like pieces being removed from a game board. You're about to dismiss it as a coincidence when you realize each one who leaves is someone you saw on that list, and each one had a crown beside their name. You feel the weight of that discovery settle in your chest. The crowns aren't just marks of favor. They're an invitation. To what? You don't know yet. But whatever it is, it's happening beyond that side door. And not being there means being left outside the most important circle of all. The king's attention shifts, briefly in your direction, and for a heartbeat you think he might summon you to follow, but he doesn't. Instead, he smiles faintly, as if to say, "Not yet." Which is almost worse than being excluded outright. Because now you're caught in the limbo every courtier dreads. Close enough to see the door, far enough to be kept from it. And as the last crown-marked figure slips away, the side door closing so softly it might have been a sigh, you understand something chilling in the Tudor bedchamber. The most dangerous place to be isn't outside in the cold, or inside it. The king's side. It's here, in between. Where you can see the power but can't yet touch it, and where everyone else can see you. You glance once more toward the curtained bed. Toward the place where secrets are born, and reputations are buried. Somewhere behind that curtain, and somewhere beyond that door, the real business of the night is happening. And if you want to survive, or better yet, win, you're going to have to find a way in. Of course, the trick will be doing it without anyone realizing that's exactly what you're trying to do. Because in this room, ambition is only attractive if it looks like obedience. And the moment they see you reaching for the crown, they might just decide to put a cross beside your name instead. The music in the next room swells, lilting and harmless to anyone listening from a distance. But here in the bedchamber, it's a smokescreen, a cheerful distraction layered over the sound of quieter, more consequential movements. You stand, still letting the notes wrap around you like the warm velvet of the curtains, while your mind churns. The crowns have gone through the side door. The dots are scattered about the room, laughing, sipping wine, filling the space with harmless chatter, which means the crosses, the ones marked for some kind of end, must be here too. You start to glance from face to face, trying to recall the list exactly as you saw it, but then you feel the unmistakable prickling sensation of being watched. Not casually, not with curiosity, but with intent. Across the room, half hidden behind a carved oak chair, a man is watching you. You've seen him before, though never this close. A pale, thin courtier, whose doublet always seems a little too loose, whose hands are always clasped, as if in prayer, whose smile never quite reaches his eyes. His name escapes you for a moment, but then you remember, he was on the list. With a cross, your stomach gives a small, traitorous lurch. If he knows that you know, he'll want to know why. He moves toward you with the slow inevitability of a cat crossing a courtyard. By the time he reaches you, you've forced a polite smile onto your face. The kind people wear when they've just been cornered at a banquet by someone they desperately wish would trip over the roast swan. "You're new here," he says, not as a question, but as an accusation. "And yet you've been noticed." It's a dangerous opening, so you give a dangerous answer. Nothing at all. Silence, in the bedchamber, can be a weapon if you use it correctly. He studies you for a moment, as if weighing your value, then leans in just enough that his words are for you alone. Be careful who you're seen standing beside. Sometimes a cross means you're finished, and sometimes it means someone's decided you're standing in the wrong place. You want to ask him what his own cross means, but before you can, the chamberlain calls for a toast. Everyone turns toward the king, whose cup is raised. The moment the toast is finished, servants sweep in with wine for those who don't already have it. One of them hands you a cup, and you take it automatically, and that's when you see it. On the rim, almost invisible in the low light, is a faint smear of something pale and chalky. Not dust, not sugar. You lower the cup slowly, masking the movement with a feigned cough. In the corner of your eye, you see the cross-marked courtier watching you, his expression unreadable. Was the cup meant for him? For you? Or is the smear harmless, something you're imagining because you've been here too long, breathing in the paranoia? Either way, you place the cup down on the nearest table and step back, pretending to be absorbed by the music. It's then that the lady with the tapping thumb appears again, materializing at your side, as though she's been waiting for this precise moment. "Careful," she says softly, her eyes fixed ahead, as though she's not speaking to you at all. "In this room, it's not the drink that kills you. It's the reason someone wanted you to drink it." And before you can respond, she's gone again. leaving only the faint scent of rosewater in her wake. You look back toward the table. The cup is gone. The cross-marked courtier is gone, and somewhere behind the side door, the crowns are still gathered, deciding something you can't yet hear. The realization settles in like a cold draft. Whatever that parchment meant, it isn't just a list, it's a map. The crowns are in. The dots are waiting. The crosses are disappearing. And if you're not careful, someone will decide it's time to draw one beside your name. It was in the quieter days of the revolt, when the clatter of boots had softened and the great halls had fallen into a half-slumber, that the palace's glasshouse became the meeting place for conversations too delicate for council chambers and too dangerous for the open gardens. The structure itself was an architectural indulgence, a sweeping expanse of wrought iron and curved panes imported from Venice, each panel humming faintly when the wind pushed against it, as though the glass itself wanted to join the conversation. Inside, the air was perpetually warm and damp, heavy with the scent of citrus blossoms and the faint resinous temps of imported cedar benches. You could sit there in the deep of winter and hear rain thrum against the transparent roof, the world outside reduced to blurred outlines and muted sound, like a painting abandoned halfway through. It was here that a certain pattern began to emerge. Men and women of influence slipping inside, under the pretext of inspecting the rare orchids or the grafted fruit trees, only to vanish into the deeper corridors, where their voices became a thread of sound woven into the hiss of the steam pipes. You would see the way a general's shoulders stiffened as a scribe murmured something in his ear, the way a court musician's hands trembled when she adjusted her instrument after being intercepted by a visiting envoy in the glasshouse. Secrets grew faster than the vines. There were whispers of letters written in invisible ink, dipped in lemon juice, so the words would remain hidden until held to the glasshouse's warm lamps. There were rumors of coded phrases buried inside the poetry recited at evening banquets, harmless to an inattentive listener, but carrying orders for those who knew the cipher. You could watch it unfold like a slow duel. Glances traded across the reflecting pool. A deliberate pause before pouring tea, a cough held just long enough to signal the need for caution. The air in there was thick with the knowledge that one misplaced word could bloom into catastrophe. What made the glasshouse dangerous wasn't simply who entered, but who pretended not to notice. Courtiers would stroll past without turning their heads, their expressions polished into a neutrality so pure it was almost a performance. Guards lingered at the periphery, their halberds resting casually against their shoulders, but their eyes followed each movement like hounds scenting a trail. It was here, under the shifting patterns of sunlight refracted through imported panes, that the true game of power was played, not in the throne room, not in the war councils, but in the pauses between sentences, when two people realized they were speaking about entirely different things while pretending to agree. If you stayed long enough in the glasshouse, you began to feel it. The strange sensation that every plant was listening. The thick leaves seemed to lean in, the flowers, turning slightly toward the sound of voices, as if eager to memorize what was said, and in some ways, perhaps they did. After all, many of the glasshouse's visitors never returned the same way they had entered, and those who did often carried with them the faint, unshakable scent of the place, a blend of earth, citrus, and the unspoken knowledge that somewhere a deal had been made, and someone's fate had just been sealed. By the time you reach this chapter of the story, you can almost feel the air in Alexandria growing heavier, as if each passing week piles another layer of tension on the city's gilded facades. Cleopatra, who had already danced a precarious waltz between survival and sovereignty, was now in a position where every step had to be measured, each move anticipating not just the intentions of her rivals, but the unpredictable tempers of Rome's most dangerous men. The palace itself seemed to hum with speculation, courtiers whispering behind painted columns, eunuchs gliding silently through the marbled halls, foreign envoys arriving with veiled faces and guarded eyes. To the common Alexandrian, life still bustled in the markets, with the scent of cinnamon and sea salt in the air, but above them, an invisible chessboard was in play, and Cleopatra was no longer a mere piece. She was attempting to be the player. Yet even the greatest strategists are bound by the pieces they must work with. And Cleopatra's reality was that her chosen allies were as volatile as the Nile during flood season. her ties to Julius Caesar, had secured her throne for the moment, but the ripples of that alliance were beginning to reach Rome, where senators with sharpened tongues and even sharper daggers were already questioning the balance of power. Some viewed her as a dangerous seductress meddling in the affairs of their republic, while others, more quietly, saw her as a potential bridge to Egypt's wealth. Cleopatra, with her instinct for survival, sensed the change in political weather long before the clouds became visible. She knew that in Rome's game of dominance, sentiment counted for little, and alliances were built not on affection but on mutual necessity. So she began laying the groundwork for relationships that might outlive any single Roman protector. Her diplomacy became a blend of performance and precision, sometimes lavish feasts to dazzle visiting envoys with Egyptian opulence, other times intimate, private negotiations conducted in candlelight where promises were whispered and debts were borne. She played the role of Egypt's living goddess when it suited her, a shrewd stateswoman when the moment demanded it, and an attentive listener when someone's vanity needed stroking. These shifting masks were not deception for its own sake. They were survival in its purest form. Yet each new alliance came with strings, and Cleopatra was constantly calculating how much of herself and her kingdom she could afford to give without binding her own hands. Even the gifts she offered were chosen with care. Rare papyrus scrolls for a Roman scholar, a jewel-encrusted amulet for a superstitious general, a shipment of fine Egyptian grain for a senator whose people were facing shortages. Every offering was a subtle investment, a coin in the bank of future influence. But behind the elegance of her strategy, there was an unspoken urgency. Because Cleopatra understood that Rome's interest in Egypt was not friendship, it was appetite. The Nile Delta was the breadbasket of empires, and whoever controlled it could feed armies, sway markets, and dictate terms. Cleopatra's throne sat atop a treasure that could tempt even her allies into becoming conquerors. And so she moved through her days with a dual awareness that charm could open doors, but only power could keep them from slamming shut. The sands of Egypt had seen many rulers come and go, swallowed by ambition or crushed under the weight of Rome's shadow. Cleopatra intended to be neither. Each decision she made in these years, each calculated smile, each artfully timed alliance, was not simply to maintain her reign, but to write herself into the story as a queen who bent history's currents toward her will rather than be swept away by them. And though no one could yet see the storms gathering on the horizon, Cleopatra was already bracing herself, her eyes fixed not on the dangers behind her, but on the ever-shifting future ahead. By the mid-1st century AD, as you stand at the heart of Rome, the city breathes with the smell of oil lamps, incense, and street food smoke, but it also holds a deep unease that no one speaks of too loudly. For in the summer of 64 AD, fire would come like a god's punishment. It began in the shops that clustered under the great Circus Maximus, where merchants stored oil, pitch, and every flammable good you could imagine. In a city built of wood and crowded alleyways, flames leaped from stall to stall like they had been waiting for centuries for this moment, and in a matter of hours, the night sky became a living wall of fire. You, a Roman citizen, or perhaps just a passerby with no claim to this place, could do nothing but watch as roofs cracked under heat, tiles exploded, and smoke filled your lungs until each breath burned. The wind shifted and the flames chased people through narrow streets. Mothers clutched children, old men staggered with bundles of whatever they could save, and thieves worked the chaos to their advantage, cutting purses and slipping into homes abandoned by owners fleeing the blaze. By dawn, entire districts were embers, but the fire was far from over. It would rage for 6 days, spared only when it found nothing left to consume, only to reignite and continue the destruction. Ancient sources disagree on the role of the emperor, for whispers rose that Nero had been seen on a high balcony, playing the lyre and singing while the city burned. Whether this was truth or political slander, it was a tale so enduring that centuries later, his name would be a curse. In the aftermath, charred stone walls jutted like broken teeth from the earth, and the air reeked for weeks of wet ash and the sweet, sickening scent of burnt flesh. But Rome was not just a city of stone, it was an idea, and so rebuilding began. Almost before the smoke cleared, streets were widened, building codes tightened, and great fire breaks planned so that such devastation could never repeat so easily. Yet for the poor, the fire was more than a disaster. It was a death sentence to whatever fragile stability they had. For rents rose sharply, slums expanded outward, and the new marble-faced structures were meant for the wealthy. You might hear the laughter of the elite over banquets in newly built atriums while the displaced still huddled in makeshift shelters, watching a Rome reborn without them. Nero himself sought to immortalize this reconstruction as part of his vision for a golden capital, erecting the Domos Aurea, a palace so vast and lavish that it included artificial lakes, endless colonnades, and walls studded with precious stones. To some, it was proof that the fire had been a blessing for him, a way to wipe clean the city's cramped past and replace it with his own grand design. To others, it was the final proof of his guilt. The Great Fire had not only reshaped Rome's streets, but also its politics, its class divisions, and its relationship with its ruler. You, standing on one of these new boulevards years later, might still feel the ghosts of that night, the heat on your face, the roar in your ears, and wonder if the city you walk through is truly Rome, or merely the shadow of what was lost to the flames. You are in a city that smells of salt and incense, where the streets are narrow, but every corner hums with whispers about the Queen's latest move. And you can feel the hum of politics in the air, as tangibly as the late afternoon heat that sticks to your skin, because Cleopatra, by now, has mastered the art of making her mere presence an act of diplomacy. She walks into a gathering of Roman officials, not simply as a ruler in exile's shadow, or a supplicant begging for her throne, but as a calculated force of nature, who knows precisely when to dazzle with wit, when to veil herself in mystery, and when to remain utterly silent, so that the absence of her words says more than the most passionate plea. And while many in the Senate still see her as a dangerous foreigner, she has been learning the subtle dialect of Roman ambition, speaking not just Latin, but the unspoken language of power, where a compliment to the right general can be more valuable than gold, and a fleeting glance toward an undecided senator can plant a seed of loyalty that might grow months later into a decisive vote. This is not the Cleopatra of romanticized legend reclining on a couch of silk with figs and wine at her side, but a strategist who treats every conversation as a battlefield, every banquet as an opportunity to map out allegiances, and every public appearance as a performance calibrated to sway the audience, whether that audience is a single commander in a shaded garden or an entire politifaction seated beneath marble columns. She knows the Romans are driven by two engines, glory and fear, so she offers them the first, while reminding them, in whispers and well-placed hints, of what could happen should Egypt fall into the wrong hands, suggesting that her enemies are also Rome's enemies, and in this she begins to weave a tapestry of mutual benefit. Though she understands that trust is still far away, and perhaps never truly attainable between Egypt and Rome. Yet Cleopatra's genius lies in her ability to navigate this impossibility with grace, to project strength without arrogance, to play the role of the cooperative ally while keeping her true motives shrouded like the Nile at dawn. And though the city's rumor mills spin endlessly, some claiming she is merely Caesar's puppet, others insisting she is the puppet master, it does not matter to her which story spreads, because both work to her advantage, both make her impossible to ignore. In the palace, she hosts feasts where Greek philosophers debate with Roman jurists, where Egyptian priests discuss astronomy with engineers from Hispania. And though the wine flows and the music swells, every seating arrangement has been thought through like the lines of a military map, each guest placed to overhear just enough to feel they've been let in on a secret, but never so much that they can see the whole game. Beyond the candlelit chambers, Cleopatra walks the streets in carefully orchestrated appearances, sometimes dressed in Greek robes to appeal to Alexandria's Hellenistic elite, sometimes in the traditional linen and gold of Egyptian royalty, to reassure her native subjects, and occasionally in plain Roman tunics when visiting the quarters of foreign merchants, signaling that she understands and honors their customs. It is all theater, yes, but it is theater with consequences, because the more she embodies every role, the more each audience begins to see her as their queen, their representative, their ally, and this is the slow, deliberate work of survival. In a world where empires shift like desert sands, Cleopatra knows that charm without strategy is wasted. and strategy without charm is doomed, so she wields them together. A matched pair of weapons hidden behind a smile that can mean 6 different things depending on who is looking. And if you happen to be one of those Roman envoys, seated across from her, with the soft flicker of an oil lamp catching in the gold at her wrist, you might think you are the one holding the advantage in this exchange, until you leave the meeting, and realize, days later, that she was the one guiding every word, every pause, every turn of the conversation, and that without ever raising her voice, or threatening you outright, she has drawn you 3 steps closer to her cause steps you didn't even know you were taking until you find yourself defending her in front of your peers, wondering when exactly you began to believe her version of events. This is Cleopatra's charm offensive, not an impulsive flourish, but a slow encirclement. A siege carried out not with catapults and battering rams, but with laughter in the right places, solemn silences in others, and the art of making everyone in the room feel that she sees them entirely, understands them completely, and values them above all others. Even if they are only another stone in the wall, she is quietly building around her future. Under the punishing glare of the midday sun, the city at the mouth of the Nile breathes slowly, like some old, patient beast. Its walls shimmering in the heat, and its streets humming with the everyday business of traders, priests, and fishermen. By now word of Cleopatra's movements was no longer just whispered among the palace servants or hinted at in the marketplace. Had become the city's lifeblood, traveling from ear to ear, embroidered with new details at every telling. She had become more than a queen. She was a walking drama, an emblem of defiance wrapped in silk and gold, a ruler who could recite Homer as easily as she could command warships. Yet power, especially in Alexandria, was never a steady possession. It was a performance that had to be renewed daily, a dance on a knife's edge between the Senate's disapproval, the murmurs of her own court, and the unpredictable moods of the people. The sea winds carried the smell of salt and distant lands into her private gardens, where she sometimes withdrew for brief moments of solitude. But even here, she was never truly alone. Slaves and attendants hovered at the edges of sight, scribes waited for her dictation, and foreign envoys plotted how best to capture her attention. Rome, ever watchful, had agents embedded everywhere, their eyes scanning for signs of weakness, their ears tuned for the smallest hint that Egypt might be vulnerable. Cleopatra knew this as well as she knew her own reflection, and she played to it, crafting every public appearance as a carefully choreographed act. The way she entered a hall, the measured pauses in her speech, the subtle placement of her hands on the armrest of her throne. Her people saw a queen. Rome saw a rival. Her allies saw an asset. And beneath it all, she carried the silent awareness that each faction, each audience, could turn against her at a moment's notice. The city's mood could be swayed by a single rumor, and rumors in Alexandria moved like wildfire over dry papyrus. Some whispered of secret alliances with distant eastern kings. Others claimed she possessed scrolls in her library containing forbidden prophecies about Rome's eventual fall. There were darker stories too, whispered in the shadows of the taverns, that she had poisoned rivals in their sleep, that she could make men love her against their will, that she was a sorceress in league with ancient gods. Cleopatra let such stories circulate unchecked. In a city where perception was power, fear was as useful a tool as admiration. But the delicate balance she maintained was about to be tested yet again, for the Roman political stage was shifting under her feet. Factions in the Senate argued over whether to keep Egypt as an ally or absorb it outright as a province, a move that would strip her of sovereignty and reduce her to a ceremonial figurehead. These debates, though distant, were not abstract. They would ripple through her palace in the form of diplomatic letters, veiled threats, and envoys with smiles as sharp as blades. Meanwhile, she had her own ambitions. The expansion of Alexandria's great library, the strengthening of her fleet, the fostering of trade routes with Nubia and India. These were not the acts of a ruler waiting to be absorbed. These were the moves of someone staking a claim to independence. But independence came at a price, and each ship she launched, each alliance she forged, added weight to the scales of Roman suspicion. The palace corridors were alive with the sounds of preparation, armor being polished, ships being stocked, scrolls being copied. Cleopatra moved through them with that particular grace of someone who knew she was being watched from every corner. Each step deliberate, each command precise. Outside her walls, Alexandria prepared too not for open war, but for the kind of political storm that could change the fate of nations without a single sword being drawn. Merchants adjusted their trade goods, temple priests polished their offerings, and common folk told stories of a queen who might yet outwit the greatest empire on earth. For now, the sea lay calm, the markets bustled, and the heat pressed down on the city like an unspoken challenge. But somewhere beyond the horizon, sails were already catching wind, bringing with them either Rome's blessing or its wrath. Cleopatra knew the difference could come down to a single conversation, a single night's maneuvering, a single calculated gamble, and she was ready to take it. If you were to stand at the edge of the Sahel in the cool hours before dawn, when the air is still heavy with the scent of dust and dry grass, you might hear it not the call of a bird or the distant hum of a truck, but the soft, deliberate crunch of boots on sand. These are not the steps of wandering herders or merchants bringing their goods to market. They belong to the lionesses of the Sahel, moving in disciplined silence through terrain that to most people seems unlivable. Out here, in this stretch between endless desert and fragile savanna, the land itself is a test. The wind scours your skin. The sun, when it rises, burns without mercy. Even the nights, cold enough to bite at your bones, feel like a challenge to those unprepared for them. Yet the lionesses are not only prepared, they are shaped by it. Their patrols are as much about endurance as they are about vigilance. Each step is measured, not simply because of the shifting sand beneath their feet, but because every pace is taken with the awareness that this land hides threats as well as secrets. Beneath dunes and acacia shadows, armed smugglers pass unnoticed. To most foreign mercenaries, drift like mirages across the horizon. Even in villages, loyalties shift like the wind. The lionesses know these truths intimately. They have learned to read the language of the desert in ways that satellites and drones cannot. A bent thorn branch means recent movement. A trail broken in a certain pattern hints at camouflaged tires. Even the sudden absence of birds can mean that trouble is near. For them, every sound and silence is a message, every shift of the sand, an entry in the desert's unwritten diary. But being a silent witness to this land does not mean they merely observe. They intervene swiftly, decisively, and often without the world ever knowing. There is no fanfare when a convoy of weapons is intercepted at dawn. Just the quiet satisfaction of a job done without the bloodshed that could have followed. And there is no press coverage when a kidnapped girl is returned to her family under the cover of night, her cries muffled by relief as her mother clutches her to her chest. The desert remembers these things, even if history books might not. Yet there is a weight to this role, one that each lioness feels deeply. They are not just soldiers. They are guardians of a fragile frontier where law, culture, and survival intersect. The desert is their home, but it is also a battlefield, one in which the enemy can be hunger, drought, ideology, or greed. And so, when you watch them standing against the horizon, rifles slung casually at their sides as the sun turns the sky from deep violet to blinding gold, you begin to understand they are the desert's silent witnesses, recording its struggles. Not with pen and paper, but with presence and resolve. Every patrol they complete, every danger they diffuse, is another line in a story that may never be told in full, yet one the land itself will never forget. By now, Venice was no longer just a city of gondolas, masked balls, and suspiciously overpriced seafood. It had become a place where the hum of printing presses blended with the smell of ink and damp paper, filling alleyways with a strange new energy. Printers and booksellers operated almost like an invisible gildenafitl, but with a network that stretched from shadowy back rooms in San Polo to the quieter corners of the Rialto. These men and women were not naive artisans simply crafting beautiful things. They were merchants of desire, traders in ideas, and occasionally smugglers of words, too dangerous to speak aloud. The church had already begun sniffing around, growing uneasy at the thought that people could acquire knowledge or scandal without the blessing of the pulpit. So, new rules began to creep in. Booksellers were told to register their wares, submit manuscripts for approval, and ensure that their shelves contained nothing that could disturb the peace. Of course, What counted as disturbing was decided by people who thought that even laughing too loudly during Mass might be a sign of moral collapse. But Venice, ever pragmatic, didn't fight the rules head-on. Instead, it adapted. Booksellers kept 2 ledgers, one for the inspectors, full of religious works and dull poetry, and one for themselves, a secret inventory that contained the works truly worth reading. You could almost picture it. A customer would wander in, perhaps looking for something officially safe, and the bookseller would, after a quick scan of the room, slide a thin volume out from under the counter. This unmarked book might contain poetry so sensual it made the reader sweat, a political pamphlet written in code, or a banned translation of a Greek philosopher who had been dead for centuries but was still somehow considered dangerous. The customers were not fools. They knew that once they walked out of that shop with such a book, they were carrying something that could make their life difficult if discovered. But that was part of the thrill. A respectable merchant might hide it in a flour sack. A nobleman might tuck it inside the pages of a prayer book. A young lover might slip it under their pillow. The city's authorities, meanwhile, played their own strange game. They had to appear as though they were controlling the trade, confiscating the occasional scandalous book, punishing the most reckless printers, but they also understood that this underground commerce was part of what made Venice richer and more powerful. A little vice, after all, could be profitable. The printers themselves were a peculiar breed, half craftsmen, half gamblers. A successful run of a risk, or politically sharp text, could make them a small fortune, but if caught, they could lose everything, including their freedom. Some became experts at disguising their work, hiding the true author's name behind initials or outright pseudonyms, sometimes even pretending a book was printed in another city to avoid the eyes of local censors. Others went one step further, altering the content itself, changing words or entire sentences so that a dangerous book became safe enough to pass inspection, then printing the real, unaltered version in secret for trusted customers. It was a balancing act worthy of an acrobat, and in Venice, acrobats were plentiful for the buyers. The act of owning one of these forbidden works was more than just possession. It was a kind of rebellion, a quiet, polite rebellion, yes, but rebellion nonetheless. You might never shout your defiance in the piazza, or openly challenge the Council of 10. But by reading something you weren't supposed to, you were claiming a small piece of freedom for yourself. That feeling of liberation was intoxicating. And it was precisely this dangerous pleasure that made the authorities nervous. Because a citizen who reads too much, especially the wrong kind of book, might begin to question things. And a citizen who questions is far more difficult to control than one who simply obeys. By the middle of the 16th century, this cat-and-mouse game between printers, booksellers, and censors had become one of the city's quietest, but most enduring dramas. It was not the kind of drama that filled the streets with shouting or blood, but rather the slow, tense kind that played out in whispered conversations and careful glances over shoulders. Venice had tamed its booksellers, yes, but only just. And the truth was, the booksellers had tamed Venice right back, teaching the city that knowledge could not be caged entirely, only slowed. And so the presses kept turning, their wheels squeaking softly in the night, printing war. If the earlier moments of the Colosseum's day had been draped in ceremony, laced with the illusion of discipline and rules, what followed was a stripping away of the facade, slow but deliberate descent into a theater of cruelty that wore its brutality openly, with no apology, no pretense of restraint. The crowd, already warmed by hours of bloodletting, was restless for escalation. The nobles in their shaded podium leaned forward. The wealthy merchants in the mid-tiers fanned themselves with perfumed cloths, and the sweating masses at the top, tears craned their necks, each of them waiting for the next grotesque invention to parade across the arena floor. This was no longer about sport. It was about dominance, about spectacle as a language of empire, about Rome reminding both its citizens and its enemies of exactly how far it was willing to go to maintain control. The gates yawned open again, and from the dim corridors beneath came the sound of dragging chains, the clink of shackles against stone, the occasional muffled cry that was quickly silenced by a soldier's bark. Prisoners shuffled out into the sunlight, some captured rebels from the provinces, some condemned criminals, and others who might have been guilty of nothing more than standing in the wrong street at the wrong time. Their clothes were torn, their skin caked with grime, and yet each carried the same weight in the eyes of the audience. They were bodies to be spent, living props in the Empire's show of force. There was no fight in them, not in the way that gladiators fought. These were the condemned, and the crowd wanted them to die badly. In previous games, such executions had sometimes been staged with a veneer of drama, reenactment of a myth, a mock naval battle, but today, the organizers had chosen something simpler, something more primal. From the opposite gates, handlers coaxed out the beasts. A lion with its mane matted from the heat, a pair of leopards pacing with low growls, and a bear that lumbered forward, as if annoyed at having been woken from sleep. Each animal was half-starved, its ribs showing through its hide. Its eyes locked on the slow-moving prisoners, as if recognizing the inevitable. The crowd murmured, then roared, the sound swelling into a single chant that pulsed through the arena. Walls. The prisoners glanced at one another, some trembling, others staring blankly ahead. A few fell to their knees, praying in languages the Romans didn't bother to understand. The handlers withdrew, the gates slammed shut, and a tense silence fell, broken a moment later by the sudden leap of a leopard, the spray of sand, and the first scream. It was not quick. The animals toyed with their victims, tearing and retreating, raking claws and teeth over skin, forcing the crowd to watch as agony stretched into minutes. The smell of blood began to drift up through the tiers, metallic and hot, mingling with the sense of sweat and spilled wine. For the emperor and his guests in the imperial box, it was another proof of power well spent. For the crowd, it was a catharsis of violence, a collective release of whatever fears or angers they carried into the arena. And for the prisoners, it was the last thing they would ever know, this circle of shouting faces, this pit of dust and sun, and the slow closing of the world into pain and darkness. By the time the sand was raked and the bodies hauled away, the audience was already thinking of the next act, eager for more. The day was far from over. If there is one thing the medieval world understood better than any era before or after, it was that laughter could be more dangerous than the sword. And nowhere was this truth more visible than in the strange, chaotic, and utterly undignified celebration known as the Feast of Fools. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a medieval king, a man who has spent the year wrapped in ermine-lined robes, issuing decrees that change the fate of entire villages, having priests compare you to David or Solomon, and seeing peasants bow so low in your presence that you sometimes forget what the tops of their heads look like. Then, on this particular winter's day, you find yourself in a great hall where the tables are turned, where the poorest, the silliest, the most irreverent clerks and servants are given your authority for a few hours, and you, the anointed ruler, are reduced to a character in someone else's joke. The Feast of Fools was not an official royal holiday. In fact, the church frowned upon it, but it was tolerated for centuries, partly because it allowed people to release the dangerous pressure of social order in a harmless, theatrical way. It was usually held around New Year's or Epiphany, that blurry time when the calendar was still shaking off the last year's dust, and the normal rules could be bent without the whole world collapsing. And in that bending lay the delicious opportunity to poke fun at everyone who was normally untouchable. Priests would dress as donkeys, altar boys would be crowned as mock bishops, and processions would be led through the streets with raucous singing, satirical chants, and a great deal of farmyard sound effects. For kings, the danger of the feast of fools was not that they might be overthrown, but that they might be laughed at, and in the medieval world, where image was everything, a single day of public mockery could stick in people's minds far longer than a year of wise governance. A skilled king knew how to survive it. You played along, laughed at yourself, and showed the crowd that you were above being offended. A foolish king tried to suppress it, and in doing so, made himself the butt of every whispered joke for months. Afterward, picture it, a hall filled with courtiers, wearing deliberately mismatched garments, playing ridiculous games that reversed the hierarchy, servants ordering nobles to fetch them wine, jesters delivering mock sermons, and sometimes, even a king of fools sitting in the real king's chair. The real monarch might be given a silly hat, a wooden spoon as a scepter, and told to dance for the crowd, all in the spirit of harmless fun, of course. Though every noble in the room knew that such spectacles were carefully remembered. These events weren't just about laughter. They were about power being briefly flipped upside down, just enough to remind everyone that kings were human. That the social order was made of people, not divine machinery. And for the king himself, this was both a test and a performance. A well-handled feast of fools could make him seem magnanimous, relatable, even loved. A poorly handled one could plant the seed of mockery in every mind present, and in medieval politics. Mockery was the slow poison that could hollow a throne, from the inside out. The irony, of course, was that many kings secretly enjoyed the spectacle, not the being mocked part, but the excuse to step out of their crushing role for a few hours. To eat and drink without the rigid etiquette, to see their own court in absurd costumes and feel, briefly, like they were part of a shared joke rather than its target. After all, power in the Middle Ages was exhausting work, and a little chaos, even chaos that made you the clown, could be a relief. But you could never forget that the laughter had teeth. Every donkey bray sermon, and every wooden mock king was a reminder that your majesty was, in part, a story that people agreed to tell, and stories could be rewritten if the audience grew restless. And so the Feast of Fools lived on, a strange safety valve for medieval society, and an annual reminder to even the most absolute ruler that the crown might rest on their head. But it sat atop a face that could, at any moment, be painted with soot and paraded through the streets for the delight of their subjects. You find yourself walking through the shaded marble corridors of the imperial palace, the air smelling faintly of cedar oil and warm bread. The sort of smell that makes a man forget that outside these walls, the empire is bleeding coin into arenas, temples, and statues nobody asked for. Augustus Seward, Augustus Snow, longer the lean, calculating politician who once whispered strategy over maps. But a man with a growing softness around the jawline and a glimmer in the eye that speaks of new appetites has begun to crave spectacles, not for necessity, but for pleasure. It is a dangerous thing when an emperor's hunger shifts from survival to indulgence. You see it in the way the amphitheaters have grown taller, in the way the gladiator's armor gleams brighter, in the way the banquets stretch from noon until lamps are lit. The treasury, which once had been carefully guarded, is now a jar without a lid. Coins flow out in golden streams to pay for musicians imported from the far corners of the empire, for exotic beasts dragged in chains from Africa, for theatrical reenactments of battles the empire didn't even fight. And the people lap it up like warm milk. They cheer for lions they will never see in the wild. They applaud actors who play at heroism on painted stages. They eat bread soaked in the same honey that once sweetened the cups of kings. The Senate, ever the watchful set of old men in togas, has learned to smile while chewing on its own resentment. They know better than to scold a ruler who can have them replaced, like cracked roof tiles. Yet behind closed doors, their voices hiss with concern. You hear the whispers. The empire's wealth is not infinite. The merchants are restless. The provinces are grumbling under heavier taxes. The legions are being paid late. But Augustus, with his new taste for grandeur, waves it all away. The people must be kept happy, he says, for a happy crowd is a silent crowd. And perhaps there is truth in that. After all, you've seen what happens when the streets grow hungry, and board shouts turn to riots, and riots turn to fires. But even you, loyal as you are, cannot ignore the unease curling in your gut. You have begun to suspect that the emperor's spectacles are no longer tools of stability, but disguises for a deeper fear, that without constant noise, without constant entertainment, the people might remember to ask questions. Questions about why grain prices have risen again. Questions about why legions are marching further and further from home. Questions about whether the empire is truly as invincible as marble inscriptions claim. And so the city is kept in a constant state of distraction. The Colosseum roars with blood and music. The streets are filled with processions. Actors dressed as gods ride chariots down avenues lined with cheering children. The bakeries work through the night to keep loaves in every hand, while the taverns overflow with wine and gossip. There are nights when you walk home under torchlight, past fountains that spill more water in an hour than an entire village might see in a week. And you wonder if the empire has begun to mistake abundance for strength. You wonder if anyone else sees what you see, that all this glitter is as fragile as a painted mask. And masks, no matter how beautiful, are meant to be taken off. And yet, the city sleeps soundly, lulled by the rhythm of drums and the promise that tomorrow will bring another spectacle. You, however, find it harder to sleep. You keep imagining what will happen on the day the drums stop. You wake before dawn to the faint sound of sandals brushing the stone alleyways outside, a muffled chorus of early risers moving through the city like soft waves on a shore. Cairo in this hour feels half asleep, its breath slow and steady, its eyes not yet open to the glare of the sun. From the window of your lodging, you can see the lightning sky pale blue, with the thinnest streak of gold, as if the horizon itself is warming up for the day. In the streets below, merchants shuffle to their stalls, carrying baskets draped in cloth. The smell of baked bread and crushed coriander drifting upward like a secret invitation. Somewhere far off, a single muezzin's call begins, floating through the cool morning air, soon joined by others, until the entire city hums with the layered harmony of prayer. But today is not an ordinary morning. You are standing at the threshold of something larger. The kind of day that centuries later will still be spoken of in stories and whispered about in marketplaces. You pull on your robe, the fabric soft from wear, and step into the street. The stones are cold beneath your feet, but already you can feel a restless energy running under them, like the pulse of a city that knows something important is about to unfold. The alleyways are narrower here, the walls so close you can touch them with both hands. They are the color of sun-baked clay, patched here and there with wooden balconies that jut out like watchful faces. As you walk, you notice more people than usual for this hour, all moving in the same direction, their conversations low but urgent. Women in loose shawls carry small bundles wrapped in cloth. Men walk with purposeful strides, their eyes scanning the road ahead. You follow them through a twisting web of lanes until the street begins to widen, the air filling with a heady mix of smells: sandalwood, musk, the sweetness of dates, the sharper tang of vinegar from a pickle seller's cart. Then, as you turn a final corner, it comes into view: the Bab al-Fouda, the northern gate of Cairo, massive and immovable. Its great arched doorway, crowned with ancient battlements that have watched over this city for hundreds of years. But today, the gate is not just stone, and iron it is dressed in color. From its towers hang great swaths of embroidered fabric, dyed in shades of crimson, sapphire, and deep green. Thin ribbons of gold thread catch the early sunlight, shimmering like liquid fire in the breeze. The scent of perfumes hangs heavy here, drifting from braziers set along the wall where attendants sprinkle powdered amber and frankincense onto glowing coals. The crowd thickens as you approach. Traders in long robes stand beside camels draped in bright woven blankets. Musicians with flutes and drums weave through the throng, their tunes quick and playful. Somewhere a boy sells honey, cakes from a tray, their tops glistening with syrup. You realize this is no ordinary market day. This is a ceremonial welcome, a moment in which the city itself becomes a stage. Whispers in the crowd tell you what is coming: a royal procession, returning from a distant victory, carrying not just spoils but stories, not just wealth but the weight of history itself. The old men near you lean on their canes, telling the younger ones that they have seen such a thing only once or twice in their long lives. It is not the gold or the horses that matter, one of them says in a voice thin with age. It is the sight of the gates opening and knowing who walks through them. As the sun climbs higher, the air grows warmer, the light sharpening every color until the fabrics blaze like fire. The drums begin first slow, deep, each beat spaced far, enough apart to make the silence in between feel enormous. Then the flutes join in, a high keening melody that winds through the crowd like a silver thread. The gates remain closed for a moment longer, the anticipation thick enough to taste. And then, with a deep groan of wood and iron, they begin to swing open. The first thing you see is the dust golden, sunlit, swirling in the air like smoke. Out of it emerges the front of the procession, standard bearers carrying long poles from which silk banners snap and twist in the breeze, each marked with intricate patterns and symbols of the ruler's house. Behind them come soldiers in gleaming armor, their helmets crested with dyed horsehair that sways with each step. Their faces are set, their movements precise, the rhythm of their march perfectly aligned with the beat of the drums. The crowd surges forward, held back only by a thin line of guards. You can see the excitement in every face, the children craning their necks, the merchants standing on their carts for a better view, the old women pressing their hands together in silent prayers of thanks or protection. And then, at the heart of it all, he appears. The ruler, mounted on a horse, draped in cloths of gold. His robes a deep indigo, that seems almost black in the shadow of the gate. His turban is wound with a single white feather, his eyes scanning the crowd with a calm, unreadable gaze. This is the kind of presence that is felt before it is seen, the kind that makes people straighten their backs without realizing it. In his right hand, he carries a staff carved from dark wood and tipped with a gleaming sphere of crystal. In his left, the reins of his horse, which steps forward with the slow, deliberate grace of an animal that knows it is part of a performance. The air around him seems to thicken, as if even the dust and sunlight wish to stay close. Behind him come the treasures, carts piled high with bolts of silk, chests heavy with coins, trays laden with spices whose scents carry far into the crowd. There are strange animals too, tall, long-necked birds from distant coasts, a small spotted cat with eyes like green glass, even a monkey dressed in a tiny embroidered jacket, sitting cross-legged on a cushion and watching everything with a look of solemn curiosity. The people gasp and point, but the ruler does not look back. His eyes are fixed ahead, toward the heart of the city. The musicians quicken their pace. The drums grow louder, more insistent. You can feel the vibration, through the soles of your feet, through the stones of the street. The crowd begins to move with the procession, flowing alongside it like a tide, carried by the sound and color and movement. Somewhere above, from the high windows of a merchant's house, a shower of rose petals drifts down, caught in the morning breeze before settling onto the shoulders of the soldiers and the mane of the ruler's horse. You stand there, watching the scent of roses and frankincense mingling in the air, the sunlight flashing off metal and silk. In this moment, you realize you are not just seeing a gate open. You are watching a city remember itself, watching it breathe in its own glory and exhale it into the world. The Bab al-Fuda will close again by nightfall, its great doors sealing the city as they have done for centuries. But the memory of this day, of the colors, the scents, the sound of the drums, will linger like perfume on the stones long after the last cart has passed, long after the last soldier has gone. And as you finally step back from the crowd, the dust still hanging in the air like gold, you carry with you the quiet certainty that you have stood at the perfumed gates of Cairo and seen them open to the world. By the time the late 30s BCE approached, the once gilded image of Cleopatra as the radiant sovereign of a thriving, independent Egypt had begun to dim under the weight of exhaustion, both political and personal, though the queen herself would never allow such weakness to show in public. Years of diplomacy balanced on a razor's edge, of maneuvering between Rome's titans, and of ruling a land constantly threatened from without and within, had carved deep lines of resolve into her soul. The atmosphere in Alexandria was no longer as carefree as in her early reign. The city's streets still bustled, but there was a subtle air of caution in the voices of merchants and the measured steps of citizens. They knew, as she did, that the fate of Egypt was now tied so tightly to the turbulent politics of Rome that a single shift in power there could undo everything she had fought for. Cleopatra's alliance with Mark Antony had secured stability for years, but the cost was rising. Octavian, calculating, cold, and relentless, was shaping Rome's public opinion against her, painting her as an Eastern temptress corrupting one of Rome's greatest generals. His propaganda flooded the forums and taverns of Italy, dripping poison into the minds of senators and soldiers alike. Cleopatra, aware of these whispers, responded with a renewed campaign of pageantry and diplomacy, hosting feasts of breathtaking extravagance to dazzle visiting envoys, commissioning temples to honor Egyptian gods and the deified Julius Caesar, and personally touring the Nile Valley to reinforce her presence among the people. The river journeys were both political theater and private reflection. In the quiet evenings aboard her barge, she could hear the distant chanting of farmers, smell the smoke from their cooking fires, and feel the weight of centuries pressing on her shoulders. She knew she was not just ruling Egypt, she was defending. The last great independent realm of the ancient Mediterranean against the tide of Roman domination. Antony, for his part, grew more entangled in Roman conflicts, and each military campaign seemed to pull him farther from the stability Cleopatra craved. When he returned, there were celebrations, but there was also urgency in their discussions. They spoke in hushed tones about troop movements, grain shipments, and the necessity of keeping loyal governors in key positions. Cleopatra understood, something Antony often ignored. Wars were not won by soldiers alone, but by the flow of resources, the loyalty of allies, and the careful management of public perception. She poured her energies into these invisible battles, while Antony fought the visible ones. Yet, the years were beginning to show their strain. The court became more insular, its inner circle guarded against any Roman sympathizer, and Cleopatra's trust in those around her narrowed. She relied heavily on a small cadre of advisors, men and women. She had known since her youth, while foreign ambassadors found her increasingly difficult to read. Still, her charisma in public never faltered. Whether addressing the Alexandrian crowd from the steps of the palace, or appearing in ceremonial dress as Isis reborn, she radiated a confidence that masked the tightening noose of Rome's ambitions. Beyond the palace walls, Alexandria remained a city of wonders. Its libraries and academies still drew scholars from far lands. Its harbors swelled with trade ships from the Red Sea to the Aegean. But the queen could feel the undercurrent of unease. A storm was gathering far to the west, and the winds of Roman politics were shifting. Octavian's hostility was no longer hidden, and Cleopatra knew that sooner or later, the struggle between him and Antony would reach a breaking point. And when that happened, she would have to wager everything, not just her throne, but Egypt itself in the outcome. This was the slow twilight before the final blaze, and Cleopatra, with all her intelligence and resolve, was already preparing for the decisive moment, even as the sands of time slipped quietly beneath her feet. Under the shifting skies of Egypt, where the sun burned hot upon the sand by day and the night was cool and restless, the power struggle between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII was about to reach its breaking point, and you can almost imagine the tension as something you could feel in your skin, like the heaviness in the air before a storm. For months now, the young queen had been playing a dangerous game, writing letters to Caesar, sending trusted messengers, and offering promises that were part political calculation, part personal charm. In Alexandria, the city seethed with uncertainty. Merchants in the great market whispered about the strange Roman ships anchored in the harbor, their sails furled, their decks bristling with soldiers whose faces were as unreadable as carved stone. In the palace, servants moved quietly, carrying trays of food and wine, yet listening with keen ears. Because in such times, even a kitchen rumor could be worth gold to the right person. Ptolemy's advisors, men with long beards and sharp tongues, urged the boy king to push Caesar out of Egypt before the Romans tightened their grip. But Caesar was not a man easily moved, and Cleopatra knew it. She also knew that her brother's court was becoming a nest of vipers, where every smile could hide a knife. The more Ptolemy's faction tightened their hold on the palace, the more dangerous it became for her to remain anywhere within the reach of their guards. And so she devised the plan that would become one of the most famous acts of political theater in all of history, a plan that would get her past her brother's watchful eyes and into the private chambers of the most powerful man in the Mediterranean. She would not come as a supplicant begging for her life in full view of the court, but as a surprise that no one could have anticipated and no one could have stopped. The story, as it would be told for centuries, was that Cleopatra had herself wrapped in a carpetor, more likely a linen sack used for transporting fine cloth, smuggled past the guards by a loyal servant, and carried through the halls under the pretense of delivering a gift to Caesar. Whether every detail happened exactly that way, no one can say with certainty, but the effect was undeniable. Picture the moment. The bundle unrolled on the floor before Caesar, and out stepped the young queen, her eyes bright, her hair gleaming, her very presence calculated to blend vulnerability with regal defiance. For a man like Caesar, who valued both beauty and wit, this was a move that could not have been more perfectly designed. It was not only daring, it was a display of intelligence, courage, and theatrical flair. She made her case directly, speaking not only of her right to rule as her father's heir, but also of the stability Egypt could offer Rome if she were restored to her throne. Caesar, who understood the value of a reliable ally in such a rich and strategically placed kingdom, listened carefully. Some might say he was swayed by her beauty, others by her intellect. But the truth is likely that he was convinced by the combination of both and by the fact that helping Cleopatra also meant weakening her brother's Roman backers, who were aligned with his political enemies. Outside that chamber, Alexandria's streets were restless, and Ptolemy's faction was already beginning to sense that something had shifted. In the following days, Caesar declared his intention to mediate between the feuding siblings, a decision that was presented as an act of Roman fairness but was in fact the beginning of a much deeper entanglement. Cleopatra, who had risked everything to put herself in front of him, had won the first and perhaps most crucial battle not on the battlefield, but in the realm of persuasion, where words and presence could wield more force than swords. Yet this victory was only the opening move. Ptolemy XIII would not accept the arrangement quietly, and Egypt was heading toward open conflict. But for now, in that moment when the linen bundle opened and the queen stood revealed, Cleopatra had changed the game entirely. The Roman general, who had crossed seas and toppled republics, now found himself drawn into the intricate, treacherous dance of Egyptian politics, and Cleopatra had placed herself at the very center of it. Under the cold sweep of morning mist rolling in from the river, you would find yourself once again among the damp stones and echoing corridors of a fortress that has seen more whispered plots than open battles. Its walls stained not by blood, but by the invisible residue of fear and ambition. For by now, the game between power and survival has shifted from loud declarations in public squares to the quieter, deadlier exchanges behind closed doors, where candles gutter low and every shadow could be an accomplice or an enemy. And in this moment you might imagine the king no longer the fierce young conqueror of tavern songs bent over a rough-hewn table, tracing maps with a finger that trembles, not from age, but from the knowledge that each line drawn means someone's death tomorrow. The ink blotches spreading like bruises across the parchment, while his most trusted scribe leans in, eyes sharp, yet careful, as though weighing whether to record the king's orders faithfully or to subtly alter them, for reasons that will never be confessed aloud. Outside, the wind sighs along the battlements, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and forge smoke, the smell of a kingdom that is holding together only because its people have not yet agreed on who should take it apart. And you are left to wonder whether these same stones once rang with laughter, with the clatter of banquets and the shouts of tournaments, or if they have always been like this, cold, listening, waiting. The king's hand pauses on the map, his gaze drifting toward the narrow slit of a window, where dawn's pale light spills onto the floor like a hesitant promise, and you realize he is not thinking of today's battle at all, but of an orchard he played in as a boy, before crowns and oaths and betrayals, before the names of foreign kings became weights on his tongue. And for a heartbeat the air seems to thicken with that memory, so fragile that even the scrape of the scribe's quill feels like an intrusion. Yet duty is a chain that tightens with each sunrise, and soon the doors will open, the captains will file in, their faces stern and expectant, each carrying their own private fears, masked as loyalty. And the room will shift from quiet reflection to the theater of command, where voices rise and strategies clash, the king's words measured but edged with steel, his orders weaving between caution and necessity. You might think this is the moment of power, but in truth it is the moment of surrender. For every decision he makes now hands a piece of his fate to others, men whose ambitions might one day mirror his own, whose allegiance might falter when the wind changes, and when the council breaks, leaving behind only the fading warmth of bodies and the sharp temps of candle smoke. He will sit alone again, staring at that same map, aware that each choice has set in motion ripples he can no longer control, and that somewhere beyond the walls a rider is already carrying his words into the hands of someone who may twist them, delay them, or ignore them entirely. You would notice the way his shoulders slump when no one is watching, the way his jaw unclenches, as though the mask of kingship is too heavy to wear in solitude. And you might even feel the urge to tell him that his burdens are no less human. For being royal, that history will not remember the ache in his bones, or the nights he did not sleep, only the victories or failures pinned to his name. But of course, You cannot speak. For in this place you are only an unseen witness. A ghost, drifting through corridors, where footsteps echo long after the walker is gone. And as the first real shafts of sunlight pierce the mist outside, striking the flag that flutters above the keep, you would understand that for all its stone and ceremony, a kingdom is as fragile as the man who leads it, and as fleeting as the breath with. Under the weight of centuries, the scene before you seems to hang motionless, as if time itself hesitates to intrude upon the moment. And yet in that stillness, 1,000 silent tensions hum like taut strings ready to snap. For the Colosseum, though it still roars with life on the surface, is now at the threshold of a transformation it cannot fully comprehend. And neither can you, because what you're witnessing is not just the fading of an institution, but the gradual erosion of a worldview. The slow unspooling of the Roman mind, from the cords of spectacle and blood, and to truly feel it, you must stand in the shadowed archways, where the smell of wet stone and iron mixes with the faint aroma of spiced wine from vendors, where merchants still hawk carved figurines of gladiators, perhaps not realizing that in a few generations these trinkets will be relics of a vanished era. And as you drift deeper into the arena's underbelly, you hear the faint dripping of water in the service tunnels, a sound that has been constant for centuries, a reminder that nature itself is patient in ways men are not. For no matter how grand the empire, water will always find the cracks, and so too will change. You recall that the empire's new faith Christianity has begun to seep into every layer of Roman society, quietly replacing the old gods without needing the crash of swords to prove its power. And it's here, in this juxtaposition, that the Colosseum feels like a wounded beast, still breathing but with the inevitable awareness that its time in the sun is ending. Its stones already holding memories that the present refuses to acknowledge. You imagine the gladiators, those fierce, almost mythic figures who once walked these corridors, now replaced by condemned criminals. The spectacle diluted into public executions rather than heroic combat. And you think of the senators in their ivory seats who still come out of habit, their togas fluttering in the wind, sipping at the last drops of a vintage that will never be produced again, their faces pretending to savor the games, even as their minds are elsewhere, perhaps on political unrest in distant provinces, or the whispered debates in the Senate about whether such displays are still in keeping with Rome's dignity. The truth is, a performance that once symbolized the empire's vigor now feels like a hollow echo, an old song played too many times, and yet the masses still cheer because they've been taught that cheering is what one does in the face of death. That noise keeps the unease at bay. Above it all, you notice the shifting of the sky, clouds dragging long shadows across the marble facade, and you realize that this same play of light and dark has been seen by every soul who ever entered here, from the earliest emperors to the most anonymous bread seller in the cheap seats. And while each of them thought themselves participants in the empire's eternal story, the truth was that they were always walking toward this very twilight. The murmurs of change are everywhere, Christian bishops preaching mercy outside the gates, new laws restricting the bloodshed, the treasury quietly tightening its flow of coin toward maintenance of the games, and you sense the Colosseum's own voice, deep and resonant, saying not in words but in the language of stone and shadow, all empires end. All theaters fall silent, all roaring crowds turn to dust, and as the sun dips lower, gilding the upper tiers in molten light, you step back into the crowd, knowing that though the Colosseum will stand for centuries more, the spirit that made it possible is already slipping away. A tide going out so slowly that most will not notice until the shore is bare.